Do you ever get the sense that things are not what they seem to be? And I'm not just talking about Instagram and marketing and the way that everybody kind of misrepresents themselves or exaggerates things on social media, although maybe that's part of it. But I'm talking about something a little deeper, a little bigger. Do you think there are myths about the world and the way it works that aren't really true? Like, do you ever have the sense that the world is full of illusions? Society at large, or people in your life telling you, well, this is what life is about, or this is the way life is supposed to be. And you have this nagging doubt that maybe life is not supposed to be this way. The Greek philosopher Plato has a response to this feeling, this sense that the world around us is not as it seems. Today I want to talk to you about Plato's Allegory of the Cave. This is one of the most famous stories in all of philosophy. This story, in a way, is a Platonic response to our human suspicion that things are not what they seem to be. So Plato gives us the story of the cave in maybe his most famous work of philosophy, the Republic. And like many of Plato's dialogues, this is a dialogue about Socrates, Plato's famous teacher, who also became like a character in his works. And in the Republic, Socrates is talking to these young Athenian guys, Glaucon and Adeimantus. And he's talking to them. They're undertaking a kind of thought experiment. They're imagining what the perfectly just city would look like. What would the ideal city be like? Just before I get into the story, I want to say that the meaning of this story, I think it's all in the details. So I'm going to give you a quick summary of Plato's Cave, and then we're going to go back and look at the details in more specificity. The story goes like this. Socrates asked his friends to imagine a group of people living in a cave, and they've lived there since childhood. And in fact, they don't just live there, they're imprisoned there. And so these people are chained up in the bottom of the cave, and we're told they're chained by their necks and they're chained by their feet, not their hands. Interesting detail. So they're chained up and they're kind of compelled to just watch the back wall of the cave. And on the back wall of this cave, they just see shadows all the time, shadows moving back and forth across the walls of the cave. And he says these prisoners, because they're bound up, they don't have anything to do, they'd spend all their time playing shadow games, just trying to like guess which shadow is going to appear next. And then like winning these guessing games or things like that, that's what they would celebrate each other for. That's what they would be proud of. And there's shadows of people and animals. And we find out later that they're being projected on the back wall of the cave by these other people who are up a little higher in the cave and standing in front of a fire and using various like statues or puppets or something to like project like images on the back wall of this cave. But the people who are chained up don't know that until one of them gets free and climbs up out of the cave to discover these guys projecting all these images on the back wall. And Socrates says when this guy escapes and when he sees the fire, like his eyes, he'd be blinded by the light, right? Because he's so accustomed to living in the shadows. And then if he goes up further, up and out of the cave itself and into the rest of the world, into the light, and sees the sun, his senses will be totally shocked, right? He'd be completely blinded by the light of the sun. But this prisoner would then also see real things in the world. Maybe he's seen shadows of dogs and now he's seen statues of dogs, but now he sees like the dog itself. And this guy would come to understand that the layers of representation and illusion, right? When he was tied up at the base of the cave, he thought that the shadow dog was the dog. That's what a dog is. But now out in the world, he sees a real dog. He sees the thing itself. And he understands that the statue of the dog is just an image of this real dog. And then the shadow of the statue is just an image of an image, right? More levels removed from the thing itself. Hey, it's me in the future. It's an image of me, actually. It might be useful to know that in the context of the Republic, the dialogue as a whole, Socrates arrives at this image of the cave within the broader context of a conversation about education and the nature of knowledge. And he likens our ascent out of the cave to these different forms of knowledge we can possess. So he talks about the visible realm and talks about like shadows and images, reflections, and then actual things that we can perceive with our senses. And he distinguishes these from things in the intelligible realm, which are things like hypotheses that we can develop based on things that we've observed. So like rules we can learn and generate based on our observed experience. And then those seem to be beneath even
first principles, which is really where Plato is always trying to go. And this is somewhat controversial in the history of philosophy because for Plato, these intelligible, rational first principles are more real even than things that we can see and taste and touch and perceive in the world. So the visible things seem to be less real, more shadow-like than the first principles. That is what he likens to the sun.
So once this prisoner has been liberated, he has this revelation. He thinks back to his old life and thinks about, being chained up, staring at shadows all day, playing these games where they're like guessing what shadow is going to come next. He realizes that was all pointless. What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there? Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for the change and pity the others? Now, there's multiple ways we can interpret this story. I'd be curious to hear about your interpretations in the comments. Is this something you're studying now? Did you study the Allegory of the Cave before? Does it live rent-free in your head since you took a first-year philosophy class? I would say the most common interpretation has to do with education. This journey, moving from the shadows into the light, up out of the cave into the real world. This is a kind of metaphor, an image of what it's like to be educated, to leave behind a world of illusions, things that are insubstantial, and to enter into a world of truth and reality and things of real substance. And when you think about learning things, this is what the experience is like. When you're learning something new, maybe you have these fuzzy, shadowy ideas. You have a rough idea about how things work. Maybe it's wrong. And then as you acquire real knowledge, you develop a firmer, more solid, real understanding of the thing you're learning about. You could also imagine, like, when you hear someone talk about something that they don't really know anything about, and they're mouthing off at the party or Thanksgiving about things they do not understand. When you think of their arguments, the things they're saying, they are like shadows, right? They might bear some resemblance to something true or thoughtful. They may use words or terms that like are kind of right, but when you push back against those arguments, when you ask follow-up questions, it's revealed that, this person doesn't actually have knowledge about the thing they're talking about. They're just playing shadow games. So that's all good. It's about education, except we haven't reached the end of the story yet. And the ending of this story really changes how we read it. Because Socrates says this guy who's escaped captivity, he's going to go back down into the cave. And one thing he says is his eyes will no longer be suited to the darkness of the cave. He's seen the truth, so he can no longer find his way around as easily as he could before. And when he gets down to his prisoner buddies, what are they going to think? They're actually going to think that he has been harmed by this experience of education, this experience of the light, because his eyes don't work anymore. He can no longer participate in the shadow games. He can't tell a duck from a dog. He seems like he's been adversely affected by his experience of the light. And then Socrates says something kind of shocking. If the liberated prisoner tried to free his fellow prisoners, they would get hold of him and they would kill him. So that's a little worrisome, because if this is an allegory about education, if it's an allegory about philosophy, then the suggestion here is that to study philosophy, to educate yourself, or to acquire education, to acquire knowledge, and then if you were to go back home and try to share that knowledge, you would be greeted with hostility and even violence. And I've been a teacher for a lot of years now, and I find my students, this really resonates with them when they talk about going away to college or university and then returning back home, maybe for the summer or Christmas time, and maybe trying to share with their friends and family the things that they've learned in their courses, in their reading. And they sort of liken it to this experience of going back in the cave and not being able to relate to people in the same way they could before. This may be a painful truth about the nature of education. Now, the other interesting dimension of this, I think, of course, is one notable person who was killed for trying to educate people was Socrates. Plato's teacher was executed by democratic Athens for two reasons, right? One was corrupting the youth, and the other was teaching new gods. And when you read Plato's dialogues, you get the sense that this is sort of part of the problem with Socrates in Athens, that he was he was taking these young Athenian men, or he was attracting these young Athenian men to the study of philosophy. And then those men who maybe had like promising careers ahead of them became like these philosophical busybodies, right? They became argumentative. They started questioning received wisdom, and they became something of a problem for their families, for their influential and powerful Athenian families. And this is part of what cost Socrates his life. So the allegory of the cave is not only, I think, just a metaphor or an allegory about the process of education. There's also a way in which this is a story about Socrates. And in that way, like, it's about the cost of philosophy, right? Like what philosophy demands. That the stakes might be high in participating in philosophy and to trying to make people in your community see things that they don't want to see. You're not going to be greeted as a liberator, right? You're going to be greeted with hostility. Let's just go back to the very beginning. We find out from Socrates that these prisoners are chained around the neck and around the feet, and their hands aren't chained. And I don't know if, like, who knows about the nature of these restraints, but if you were tied up and your hands were free, don't you think you might try to free yourself? So the fact that their hands are untied in this image actually, I think, kind of suggests something about their willing participation in their own imprisonment. On some level, these people who are imprisoned are content with the shadows. That's why when the liberated prisoner comes back down, they kill him. They don't want to go up. They don't want to see the light. And in fact, this was true of the initial prisoner as well. One of the strangest details, I haven't mentioned this yet, the prisoner doesn't actually just escape on his own. And if someone dragged him away from there by force, up the rough, steep path, and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light, with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of the things now said to be true? So this prisoner who is liberated, he seems to be liberated against his will. He's compelled to stand up and turn around and look at the fire. It hurts his eyes. He doesn't want to go. He's dragged up this steep path, up and out of the cave, and made to see the sun. So then, like, if we're thinking about this allegory, like, who are these people? Like, why is he being dragged out, right? Like, if we're trying to map that on to real world experience, does this suggest that, like, the role of a teacher is you're going to have to be kind of rough with the student? Certainly education is, like, kind of uncomfortable at times when, like, we learn things, especially when we learn things we don't want to learn, when our beliefs and our biases and our preconceptions are challenged. That can be uncomfortable. But what do we make of this process of being forcibly dragged out of the cave of ignorance and into the light? Maybe it's the case, like, as a teacher, educating, things that students have to do are unpleasant. You got to get up for class. You got to read books. Maybe you don't want to read. You got to write papers, meet deadlines. Like, everybody likes this sort of idea of studying philosophy or studying literature, these things like, oh yeah, I'd love to just, like, sit around all day and philosophize. Maybe that's not how it works. Maybe you got to be, like, dragged by your collar, right? Write the papers, read the pages. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe education is dragging you against your will out of the cave. The last thing about this story I think you want to think about is the guys by the fire, the puppeteers or the people with the statues who are projecting the shadows. To me, they are maybe the most interesting people in this whole little image. Because again, as we're trying to, like, map this on to our real world experience, who are these people supposed to represent? They seem to be manipulators, right? And they're masters of images. Who are the people who project the shadows? There's a case to be made, I think, for Socrates, maybe poets fit that role. Elsewhere in Plato's Republic, Socrates expresses some concern about poets and the kinds of myths, the kinds of stories that they feed to the youth of Athens and putting bad ideas in their heads. So maybe we understand these masters of shadowy images to be artists. However, insofar as the whole thing is also in some way about Socrates, and if we think about, this liberated prisoner being a kind of Socratic figure who goes back into the cave and tries to teach new gods, right? And corrupts the youth or educates the youth. In that way, the cave seems to be a political image as well, right? So that that this is about the relationship between philosophy and politics. So that when you try to speak truth to power, or when you try to argue or say something that contradicts the received wisdom, the established truths that everybody in the community believes, when you challenge those, you're going to be met with hostility. And if it is a kind of political image, then we might want to rethink these puppeteers. Are they instead political leaders who use myths to keep people in prison? Are the myths necessary? Like the people who are imprisoned seem to be content. Do people need these myths that the politicians circulate? Or do we just take pleasure in the myths that are being circulated about the world and the way it works? In the modern world, now Plato wouldn't have thought in precisely these terms, but I think in our contemporary environment, it's interesting to think about the media. We often talk about media as circulating myths, images, ideals, feeding us with lifestyles and narratives about the way things work or the things we ought to want. And we take great pleasure in those narratives and those myths. We happily consume them. And if someone came and said, I'm going to take all these away, you're not going to get to enjoy these anymore, I think we would feel attacked. But maybe those narratives, those myths that we're being fed constantly now, maybe those aren't good for us. Maybe they conceal from us the truth. I hope this story makes you think. If you want to learn more about Plato or about Socrates and his execution by democratic Athens, you should check out this video over here on Plato's Crito. I will see you there, and I'll talk to you soon.